Kansas Wind, October 1887. 5 shots. 1 hole. At 60 yards in the dark, but that comes the next night. Right now there is only laughter, bleeding through the glass before her hand even reaches the door. 6 men inside. A revolver hanging on the rack behind the counter, and carved into the bottom of its grip, 2 letters and the shape of a hawk in flight. Something the man behind that counter has never once bothered to look at. He doesn't know what he's holding, doesn't know where it was taken from, doesn't know that the woman about to walk through his door pressed those marks into the wood herself. 30 years ago, at the tip of a finishing nail and a small hammer, the wind cuts through a town that's been dying for 2 years. A window gone dark, a notice on the schoolhouse door counting down the days. On the boardwalk, an old woman with hair white as bone stands still. They look at her the way you look at empty space. They are about to make their last mistake. She pushes the door open, the bell rings, and 6 men turn to look. The laughter hit her before she even touched the door handle. She could hear it through the wood, through the glass, through 30 years of keeping her mouth shut, and her head down, and her hands folded in her lap, like a woman who had forgotten what her hands were once capable of doing. Harriet Vane stood on the boardwalk, outside Dalt's General and Firearms, Clearwater Bluff, Kansas, and she listened to men laugh. October 1887. The wind off the prairie had teeth that morning, cold and mean and indifferent, the way only a Kansas wind knows how to be. It cut right through her wool coat, right through the gray dress beneath it, right down to the scar on her left forearm that she never explained to anyone. Not because the explanation was complicated, because the explanation was hers, and she had learned, over many years, that some things belong only to the person who lived them. She was 67 years old. Her hair had gone white sometime in her 50s. Not gradually, not gracefully. One winter it was iron gray. The next spring it was white as bone, as if something inside her had simply decided, enough. No more pretending, no more slow transitions. Just the truth, all at once, worn on her head for anyone who cared to look. Not many people looked. That was the thing about Clearwater Bluff in 1887. Nobody looked at the widow Vane. Nobody had for years. She came into town twice a week, maybe 3 times when the weather allowed. She bought flour, coffee, sometimes a small piece of salt pork if the price hadn't climbed again. She nodded at people who nodded at her. She did not linger. She did complain. She did not raise her voice or lower her eyes or do any of the 100 small things that might have made people notice her. Which was, she had decided long ago, exactly the point. She pushed the door open, the bell above it rang, and 6 men turned to look at her. Rufus Dalt was behind the counter. He was a big man, the kind of big that had once been muscle and was now mostly habit. His mustache was too large for his face, and he knew it and wore it anyway, the way men wear things they've committed to even after they've stopped working. He was maybe 45, maybe 50, the kind of age where a man who has never told no begins to look permanently annoyed at the world for failing to arrange itself according to his preferences. He was mid-sentence when Harriet walked in. Something about a horse. Something that had made the other 5 men laugh. And when she pushed through the door and the bell rang and the cold air followed her in, Rufus Dalt did what Rufus Dalt always did when someone interrupted him. He kept talking. Not to her. About her, not to her. Well, he said, loud, performing, playing to his audience the way a man does when he has one and doesn't want to lose it. Look what the prairie wind dragged in. 2 of the men chuckled. The sound was low and comfortable. The sound of men who had been laughing at the same things for so long that the laughing had become reflex. No longer a reaction, just a sound they made. Like water finding its level. Like a habit so old it had forgotten being chosen. Harriet didn't stop walking. She moved to the counter at the same pace she'd crossed the boardwalk. The same pace she crossed every room. Unhurried. Not slow. Just deliberate. Like every step had been decided on well in advance. Like she had measured the distance between the door and the counter. Before she ever put her hand on the handle, she reached into the pocket of her coat, placed a single piece of paper on the counter. Then she looked up at Rufus Dalt and said, quietly, "I'm here for the Colt. Single action army. Nickel finish. 7.5-inch barrel. The one hanging on the rack behind your left shoulder." Rufus turned, looked at the gun, turned back, and the smile that came onto his face then was the specific smile of a man who has decided something is going to be funny before he's even heard the rest of it. A man who has already written the ending and is just waiting for the world to catch up. "Lady," he said, "that's a .45 caliber revolver. I know what it is." "You sure about that?" "I've known what it is since before you were born, Mr. Dalt." That got a different kind of laugh from the men. Shorter, more surprised. The kind of laugh that happens when something unexpected enters a room and the room isn't quite sure how to classify it. Rufus's smile tightened at the edges. Just slightly. Just enough. "That gun's worth $14, he said. She placed $14 on the counter. Exact. Not a cent more. Not a cent less. The bills laid flat and even, the way a person lays things down when they have been thinking about the moment for a long time and have decided exactly how it will go. He looked at the money. Looked at her. Looked at his audience. Calculating. The way men calculate when they've been maneuvered into a corner they don't want to admit is a corner. "Now why," he said, slow, drawing it out, "would a woman like you need a gun like that?" And one of the men, younger, leaning against the far wall, with his thumbs in his belt loops, the particular posture of a man who has not yet been required by life to stand up straight, said it before Rufus even finished the thought. "Probably can't even lift it." Laughter. Proper laughter this time. The kind that fills a room. Harriet did not look at the young man. She kept her eyes on Rufus Dalt. Her hands were flat on the counter. Still, not gripping anything. Just resting, the way hands rest when they have no reason to be nervous. When they have been still in harder moments than this, and know the difference between a moment that requires tension and a moment that does not. "The gun," she said. "Now hold on. The money is on your counter. The gun is on your rack. I would like to complete this transaction and be on my way." Rufus leaned forward, lowered his voice to the kind of low that is really just a different performance. An intimate one. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't you go on home and let your son or your son-in-law come in and handle this for you, and I'll hold the peace until. I have no son, nephew then. Some man who can. The gun, Mr. Dalt." He straightened up, folded his arms, made a decision. The decision of a man who has confused stubbornness with authority for so long that he can no longer tell them apart. That particular piece isn't for sale. Silence not. The silence of a room waiting for something to happen. The silence of a room that has already decided the conversation is over and is just waiting for the old woman to understand that and leave. The silence of 6 men who have collectively concluded that they know how this ends. Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at the gun, at the rack it hung on, at the specific way it caught the morning light coming through the window behind her. The nickel finish, dulled with years, catching the gray October light and holding it, and something shifted in her face. Not anger, not hurt, not the complicated expression of a woman being dismissed. Something quieter than all of those things. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like finding something you had not been certain still existed. "Take it down," she said. "I just told you. Take it down and turn it over. Look at the bottom of the grip." Rufus stared at her. Nobody moved. The young man against the wall had stopped smiling. Not dramatically. Just. The smile had quietly left his face while he wasn't paying attention to it. Then, slowly, the way a man does when he wants to prove that he's humoring someone rather than listening to them, Rufus reached back and lifted the Colt off the rack. He held it loosely, almost carelessly, with the ease of a man who has handled guns his whole life and stopped being impressed by them a long time ago. He turned it over, looked at the grip. His face changed, just slightly, just enough. The way a face changes when it encounters something it had not prepared for. He'd seen things stamped or scratched into gun grips before. Initials, mostly. Sometimes a date. Sometimes something crude and quickly done. But what was on this grip was neither crude nor random. It was careful, precise. The work of someone who knew exactly where they were putting every mark and why. Someone who had taken their time with it. Someone who had pressed each mark into the wood with the patience of a person who understood that the things you mark belong to you, and the things that belong to you are worth marking correctly. 2 letters. HV, and beneath them, so small you had to look for it, a single shape, a hawk in flight. Wing spread, no larger than a thumbnail, carved with something fine. A nail, maybe, the tip of a tool. Something small in a careful hand. "Where did you get this gun, Mr. Dalt?" Her voice was still quiet, still even. But something in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it, and nobody could have said exactly what it was. Not threat. Not accusation. Just weight. The specific weight of a question that already knows its answer. Rufus set the gun on the counter. Slowly, "Bought it off a trader," he said. 2 years back. Maybe 3. "Did you ask him where he got it?" "Traders don't usually." "Did you ask him?" "Not a question." "Not anymore." "No," Rufus said. Harriet looked at the gun on the counter, at the initials on the grip, at the small hawk she had pressed into the wood herself 30 years ago, with the tip of a finishing nail and a small hammer. In the kitchen of the house she and Cormac had built together on the western edge of this very town. She had done it the evening after he gave it to her, sat at the kitchen table, with the lamp lit against the autumn dark, pressing each mark slowly and deliberately, because Cormac had said she should mark what was hers, and he was right. He was always right about the things that lasted. She picked it up. It weighed exactly what she remembered. Which was, somehow, both exactly right and the most painful thing in the world. The weight of something that had been absent for 30 years and had not changed. While everything else had. "HV, she said very quietly. "Harriet Vane. That's my name, Mr. Dalt. Those are my initials. And that hawk." She turned the gun slightly so he could see it better, though she suspected by now he did not need to. "My husband pressed that into the grip the day he gave this to me, which was 30 years ago. Which means this gun was taken from my home without my knowledge or my consent. Which means this transaction is not a sale." She put the $14 back in her coat pocket. "This," she said, "is a recovery." She put the Colt in the other pocket, and she turned and walked toward the door at the same pace she had walked away from it. Unhurried, not slow, just deliberate. Like every step had been decided on well in advance. Behind her, no one said anything for a full 5 seconds. Which is a long time in a room full of men who have been laughing. And then the young man against the wall, the one who'd said she probably couldn't lift it, said, in a completely different tone of voice, The tone of a man who has just revised something significant. Who is she? Rufus Dalt didn't answer, because Rufus Dalt didn't know. And that, Harriet thought, as the bell above the door rang again, and the cold air reached up to meet her face, was exactly how she had wanted it. For 30 years. Exactly. The town of Clearwater Bluff had been dying for 2 years. Not all at once. Not with any single catastrophic event that people could point to and say, there. That's the moment. That's when we lost it. Towns that die that way are rare, and their residents at least have the clarity of a clear before and after. Clearwater Bluff had no such clarity, had been dying the way most things die when no one is paying close attention. Slowly, from the edges inward. The way a fire goes out not in a moment but in a gradual withdrawal of heat, a pulling back from the margins until only the centers two were warm, and then the center goes too, a business closing here, a family leaving there, a notice posted on a door that used to have a different kind of paper on it, a menu, a schedule, an advertisement for something that implied a future, a window going dark that used to be lit. The schoolhouse had been the first real wound. Nor Finch had been teaching at Clearwater Bluff since 1880. 7 years. 31 students at her peak, down to 19 now, as families drifted away, and the children drifted with them. She was 28 years old, red-haired, and possessed of the specific determination that comes from being the kind of person who decides early in life that they will be useful or they will die trying, and considers both outcomes preferable to the alternative of being neither. She had repaired the schoolhouse roof herself one summer, not with help, by herself, on a borrowed ladder, in July heat that would have stopped most people before they reached the second rung. She had ordered books from a catalog. When the town fund ran dry, and paid for 3 of them out of her own wages without mentioning it to anyone. She had stayed when teachers in 2 neighboring towns had decided that dedication was fine in theory and intolerable in practice, and had gone back east to find easier lives. Nora Finch had stayed. And then, 6 weeks before Harriet Vane walked into Dalt's General and Firearms, she had found a notice on the schoolhouse door. It was a legal document, properly formatted, in language that was technically precise and deliberately difficult to argue with. Aldous Greer's company, Greer and Associates Land Development, chartered in Topeka, operating in 3 counties, had purchased the claim on the land under the schoolhouse from the previous holder. Whoever that was, however that had happened, and the company intended to develop the parcel as part of a larger acquisition strategy. The school had 6 weeks to vacate. A representative had come. Very polite, very clean suit. He had explained the situation to Nora in the measured tone of a man who has delivered this kind of news many times and has found that a measured tone reduces the likelihood of direct confrontation. He had handed her the document. He had apologized for the inconvenience, which was the word he used. Inconvenience, as if the displacement of 19 children from their school was a matter of scheduling rather than consequence. He had tipped his hat and left. 6 weeks, which, by the time Harriet walked out of Dalt's General into the October morning, had become 2 weeks, 14 days. The church had gotten the same notice 3 weeks earlier. The blacksmith's shop, 2 farms on the northern edge of town whose owners had worked the land for 15 years, and received acquisition notices as their reward. The Greer Company was moving through Clearwater Bluff the way water moves through cracked earth, not with force, not loudly, just finding the gaps, widening them, slowly, patiently, without apology or drama. Until the structure gave way on its own. Until the people left not because they were pushed but because there was nothing left to stay for. That was the elegant part of it. That was how Aldous Greer had improved on his father's methods. Silas Greer had used force when it was necessary and intimidation when it wasn't, and both approaches left evidence and created enemies and occasionally attracted the wrong kind of attention. Aldous had learned from watching his father operate. He had taken the empire Silas built and made it cleaner, more patient, more careful about documentation and process and the specific language of legality that makes one thing look exactly like another thing while being fundamentally different in nature. He did not take land. He acquired it. He did not displace people. He completed transactions. He did not break laws. He operated within them, in the spaces between them, on the margins where the law's language ended and its intention did not quite reach. And Sheriff Aubrey Trace, who had been sheriff of Clearwater Bluff for 9 years, who had once been a man people looked to when they needed someone to tell them what was right and what they should do about it. Sheriff Trace had stood at the last town meeting and reviewed the paperwork and said that the transactions appeared to be legal and there was nothing in his jurisdiction that he could. He had trailed off because even Aubrey Trace, who had been many things over 9 years, but had perhaps not been a coward in the earliest of them, could not quite bring himself to finish that sentence in front of the people who had trusted him. Someone in the back of the meeting room had said, very quietly, so quietly, that some people weren't sure they'd heard it at all, "Shame on you, Aubrey." But quietly or not, the words hadn't changed anything. The Greer Company kept sending notices. The people of Clearwater Bluff kept folding them up and putting them in their coat pockets and walking home and telling each other that something would change, that someone would figure something out, that things didn't just end like this, not when people had spent their lives building them, not when children were involved, not when the church and the school and the well. At the center of town were the things at stake. Telling each other, in other words, what people tell each other when they have run out of anything concrete to do. Harriet Vane had lived on the western edge of Clearwater Bluff since 1853, 34 years, which meant she had been here before most of the people who currently called it home. Before the church, which had been built in 1859. Before the schoolhouse in 1863, which Nora Finch now taught in and was about to lose. Before the hotel, which had gone up in 1866, when the cattle drives were coming through and money was briefly easy, and everyone believed the easy money was permanent because that is what people believe about easy money until it stops. She had been here when this place was not yet a town but a set of intentions, a collection of people who had looked at the flat Kansas land and seen in it something that was mostly stubbornness and hope and the specific conviction of people who have walked far enough west that going back is no longer a real option. She and Cormac Vane, who had come from County Cork at 19 years old, with nothing except the clothes he was wearing and a talent for hard work so fundamental, it was less a skill than a characteristic, the way some people are tall or have a particular color of eyes, who had come over on a ship during the years when ships from Ireland were full of bull, who had decided that whatever waited for them across the ocean could not possibly be worse than what was behind them, who had spent 2 years in Ohio working other men's land before deciding that working other men's land was a fine way to make other men wealthy and a poor way to make anything of yourself, who had found Harriet at a farm auction in eastern Ohio, of all places, where she had outbid 3 grown men for a mule and a plow, where he had watched her do this, watched her stand at the edge of a crowd of men and raise her hand each time, and not look at them when they turned to see who was bidding, and not stop when the price climbed past what most people would have paid, and had decided, apparently, that this was the person he wanted to walk west with. He had introduced himself afterward. She had been polite. He had asked where she was heading. She had told him west, generally, which was where most people with any sense were heading if they had the freedom to choose a direction and the Constitution to follow it. He had said he was heading the same way. She had said that was fine. 2 months later, they were married in a small ceremony with 4 witnesses in Springfield, Illinois, which neither of them had any particular attachment to. And 3 months after that, they were in Kansas with their mule and their plow, and the specific feeling of people who have arrived somewhere that might, with sufficient work and patience, come theirs. They had walked the land for 3 days before Cormac stopped on a particular rise, on the western edge of what would become Clearwater Bluff. Put his hand flat on the earth and felt something in it that he said he couldn't describe in words. Some quality that was either real or the projection of a man who desperately wanted to be done walking and had decided this was the place. Harriet had stood beside him and looked at the land and felt the same thing. So they stayed. And Cormac had filed the land claim in the spring of 1853. Both their names, at his insistence, which was not how things were typically done, and which she had argued against. Because practical woman who understood that the law as written and the law as practiced were different animals, and that putting her name on a document alongside her husband's was more likely to create complications than clarity. Cormac had listened to all of this, and then he had looked at her with that particular expression he had, patient and immovable as a fence post in summer ground, and said, "Hattie, it's your land as much as mine. More, maybe, since you're the one who's going to keep us from doing anything stupid with it." Both names on the paper, Harriet Vane, Cormac Vane, filed at the Federal Land Office, stamped, registered, sent to Washington, D.C., where it sat in a federal record that Harriet very much hoped had been undisturbed for 34 years. She had a copy. She had always had a copy. From the day the original was filed, she had kept a copy in the cedar box under the kitchen floor and the hiding place Cormac had built into the boards, in the way that men who have grown up with nothing build hiding places. As a matter of course, not from paranoia, but from the practical understanding that the things you value should be kept somewhere than where other people can see them. Even after Cormac died, especially after October 1857. 30 years ago exactly now. The worst night of her life, which she had survived not because surviving was easy, but because the alternative was letting the wrong people win, and she had decided, standing in the dark in the field beside the house, with Cormac's blood on her hands and the sound of a horse going away through the trees, that the wrong people were not going to win. Not if she had anything to do with it, which she intended to. She had kept the copy in the box, under the kitchen floor, beneath 3 inches of solid wood and 30 years of patience that was not. She needed to be clear about this, because people confused patience with passivity, and they were not the same. Patience that was not emptiness, not resignation, not the slow surrender of a woman who had lost the most important person in her life and had decided that everything else was diminished in comparison. Patience that was work. Deliberate, accumulated work. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. Like a woman buying flour and coffee twice a week. Like a widow getting old in a small house on the edge of a small town in Kansas, waiting. She walked home from Dalt's General with the Colt in her pocket and the wind at her back and something moving in her chest that she had decided, a long time ago, she was done calling grief. Grief had taken enough of her. 30 years was more than sufficient. She had given it what it asked for. The first year after Cormac, when she barely left the house and barely ate and barely slept and lay in the bed they had shared and talked to him in the dark, that she was certain would have frightened anyone who heard it. The second year, when she went through the motions of living while feeling that she was watching herself do it from somewhere slightly removed, like a woman watching a play about her own life from a seat too far back to see the expressions clearly. The years after that, when the grief had gradually changed character without diminishing in quantity, less sharp, more pervasive, the way a wound changes as it heals into something that is better, but not gone. She had given grief all of that. She was not giving it any more. What was in her chest as she walked home was something different. Something she hadn't felt in years, since before the grief had started, maybe. Since she was a younger woman who had not yet learned that the world was capable of taking the most irreplaceable things from you without warning and without apology. It was not quite excitement. It was something older than excitement. Something with more weight to it. Purpose. She had been watching the Greer family since before Aldous Greer was old enough to shave. Had watched his father, Silas Greer, build his land empire out of the wreckage of other people's bad luck and worse circumstances. Watched him file claims on properties after their owners died or disappeared, or simply found themselves unable to sustain the legal costs of fighting a man with more money and more lawyers than they had. Watched him cultivate relationships with county commissioners and state officials, and the particular kind of men who wear good suits and speak smoothly and have soft hands that have never done anything that could be called labor. Watched him die in 1879, comfortable, unpunished, having handed everything he'd built to his son, who was smarter than his father in the ways that were professionally useful and not meaningfully different in any of the ways that mattered. She had been watching Aldous Greer for 20 years, and here was what neither Silas nor Aldous had ever known. What Rufus Dalt didn't know, what Sheriff Trace didn't know, what no one in Clearwater Bluff knew, because she had been so careful, so deliberately and relentlessly ordinary in the way she moved through the world, that she had given no one any reason to look at her twice. The land they were acquiring, the land Greer and Associates was moving through, parcel by parcel, notice by quiet legal notice, with its polite representatives in clean suits and its carefully worded documentation. She owned it, not all of it, but the parcel at the center, the original claim, the one the schoolhouse sat on, the one the church sat on, the one with the well at its edge that half the town drew water from every morning. The Vane claim, 1853, both names, her name. She came through her front door and went to the kitchen and put the Colt on the table and looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. Not lingering. She did not permit herself to linger over things that were over. What was done, and there was a great deal yet to do. And lingering was a luxury she had never particularly been able to afford and was not about to start affording now. She put water on for coffee, knelt on the kitchen floor, slowly, because 67 years old means you negotiate with your knees rather than commanding them, and your knees negotiate hard, and pressed her fingers to the third board from the left wall. Felt the board give at the hidden catch. Lifted it. The box was there, where it had always been. Cedar, brass fittings, the size of a large family Bible. She lifted it out, set it on the floor, closed the board, carried the box to the table, opened it. The land documents were on top, folded inside their original envelope, yellowed now but intact. The paper still firm, the ink still legible, the federal stamp still clear. Beneath the documents, a letter she had written in 1879 and not yet sent. Beneath the letter, a small leather journal, thin, no more than 30 pages in her own handwriting. Names, dates, transactions, the pattern of what Silas Greer had done, and what Aldous Greer was doing, recorded over 30 years in handwriting small enough that most people would need to hold it very close to read, and beneath the journal, a photograph, daguerreotype. She and Cormac, Kansas City, 1855. They had gone to register the original claim in person because Cormac said he didn't trust the mail with something that important. And she had agreed, and they had made the trip, and someone had suggested the photograph. And Cormac had been enthusiastic, and she had been less enthusiastic, but had not said no. She was 35 in the photograph. He was 38. Neither of them was smiling. Photographs in 1855 required you to hold still for long enough that smiling became physically difficult to sustain. But there was something in both of their faces that was adjacent to a smile. The faces of two people who are where they intend to be and have decided that is sufficient reason to be in good spirits. She looked at his face for a moment, just a moment. Then she put the photograph down, face up, on the table beside the Colt. The coffee was ready. She poured a cup, sat down, sat across from the photograph and the gun and the open cedar box, and thought about Nora Finch and 19 children and a school with 2 weeks before it was taken. She thought about the church bell she could hear on Sunday mornings from her kitchen window, the sound of it, moving across the flat Kansas land in the early quiet before the wind picked up. She thought about the well at the center of town that people had been drawing water from for more than 20 years. She thought about Aldous Greer, who wore his father's seal ring on his right hand and who had no idea at all, that the woman he was displacing from a 2-room house on the western edge of Clearwater Bluff had a piece of paper with her name on it that predated everything he thought he owned. Then she thought about Judge Percival Oakes, retired, easternmost house in town. 71 years old, 40 of them spent in the law, which was not the same as spending 40 years in justice, but was as close as the law generally got. He had known Cormac, had respected him, which was not something Percival Oakes offered easily. She would go see him this evening. But first, she picked up the Colt, turned it in her hands. The nickel finish had dulled in the years since she'd last held it, worn away in patches, the steel beneath, showing through like the truth, showing through a story that hasn't quite held together. The grip felt exactly as she remembered. The weight was exactly as she remembered, the way it settled into her palm, the specific geometry of it, the particular way her index finger found the trigger guard, without looking, without thinking, the way your hand finds a tool it has used for years, even in the dark. Exactly as she remembered. She set it down, picked up a cloth from beside the stove, and began, slowly, methodically, to clean it. Outside, the October wind was finding the gaps in the window frames, testing them, pressing through in thin, cold lines the way it always did when the temperature dropped and the wood contracted. The house was warm from the stove. The light was good. The coffee was hot. She ran the cloth along the barrel. 30 years, she thought. That was how long she had been patient. 30 years of watching and recording, and waiting for the moment when Silas Greer's son made the specific mistake his father had also made. mistake of believing that the people around you are scenery, that they exist as backdrop, that they are defined by what they appear to be, and not by what they actually are and have been and are still becoming. 2 weeks, she thought. That was how long Nora Finch had. The cloth moved in small, careful circles. 2 weeks was not a limitation. 2 weeks was a deadline, and she had always worked better with a deadline, something to aim at. Something that turned the abstract into the concrete and the someday into the specific date on the calendar. She had been waiting 30 years. What was 14 days? That evening, walking the mile east into town to see Percival Oakes. She passed the schoolhouse just after 4 o'clock. Late enough that the students were gone, early enough that the light still had some quality to it. That thin October gold that arrives in the last hour before dusk and makes even ordinary things look briefly important. The schoolhouse was a single-room building, white-painted once, and weathered now to something closer to the color of old cream, with a porch and 3 steps and a bell post out front. Nora Finch was on the porch, sitting on the top step, still in her school dress, arms wrapped around her knees in the posture of someone who has run out of productive things to do with their stress and has resorted to simply containing it. She was looking at the notice pinned to the door behind her. She had probably been looking at it for a while. She looked up when she heard footsteps on the road. Saw Harriet, Mrs. Vane, she said. Automatic politeness of a woman who is deeply upset and still has her manners, which was a combination Harriet had always respected. Miss Finch, Harriet said. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked at the notice, looked at Nora, at the specific quality of her youth in that moment. Not naivety. Nora Finch had never been naive, but a kind of freshness that had not yet been worn down to its final texture by the sustained friction of the world doing what the world does to people who care about things. How many students? Harriet said. 19 ages, 6 to 15. The youngest is Margaret Holloway's girl. The oldest is the Briggs boy, who is too old really, but helps with the younger ones, and I've never had the heart to tell him to stop. And if the school closes, Nora's jaw tightened in the way jaws tighten when a person is deciding whether to say what they actually think. The nearest school is 11 miles east. For the families on the northern farms, they've got 3 miles just to reach the edge of town on a good day. In January, with snow, she stopped because the sentence finished itself, because some things go without saying, and both women standing there in the October afternoon knew. Without saying, what happened to children who had 11 miles of winter Kansas between and an education? Harriet looked at the notice for another moment. Then she looked at Nora Finch directly. Keep the school open, she said. Mrs. Vane, go to work Monday morning, Tuesday, every day, until someone physically prevents you from walking through that door. A pause. Do not make it easy for them by leaving before you are forced to. Nora opened her mouth, closed it. The expression on her face was complicated in the way expressions are when hope and disbelief arrive at the same moment and neither is willing to cede the floor. And what, she said carefully, is going to change between now and then? Harriet considered the question as she would have considered it at any other moment fully, without hurrying, giving it the weight it deserved. 30 years of watching. The land documents in the cedar box under her kitchen floor. The leather journal. The correspondence she had maintained, quietly and carefully, for years. 3 letters sent 6 months ago to 3 specific people in 3 specific places, each containing documents she had been assembling since 1879. A retired judge on the eastern edge of town. and a Colt single-action army. Nickel finish, with her initials in the grip that she had cleaned that afternoon for the first time in 30 years and found to be in better condition than the years ought to have allowed. "Things," Harriet said, "are already changing." She nodded to Nora and walked on. Judge Percival Oakes was on his porch when she arrived, which was where he spent most evenings now. A man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms had apparently developed, upon retirement, a deep preference for spaces with clear sightlines and no one talking. And horses. He sat in a wooden chair and watched the prairie and thought femme who has spent 40 years listening to other people's arguments thinks about when he finally has the quiet to think his own thoughts. He saw her coming up the path. He didn't say hello, didn't say good evening, didn't say what brings you here, which was what most people would have said. What he said was, "I was wondering when." She sat down in the chair beside him. They looked out at the eastern edge of town in silence for a moment. The last of the October light was going. The temperature was dropping the way it does in Kansas in autumn. Fast, without negotiation, the cold arriving all at once from somewhere just past the visible horizon. "You know about the notices," she said. "I know about everything that happens in this town," he said. "I'm old, not blind. Greer's company has been acquiring parcels for 2 years. The school has 2 weeks. The church has already used its 3. The northern farms, I know. The paperwork looks legal. It probably is legal," he said. "In a specific and narrow sense of the word, in the specific and narrow sense that ignores the 1853 land claim." A pause. He turned to look at her. His face in the failing light was all plains and shadows, the face of a man who had been listening to people for 50 years and had learned, through repetition and disappointment and occasional surprise, to hear the weight behind the words rather than the words themselves. "The original vein claim," he said. "Both names. Filed correctly. Registered at the Federal Land Office. The central parcel, which includes the ground under the schoolhouse. The church. The well." He was quiet for a long moment. "Hattie," he said, and that was a name she had not heard from anyone in. She did not count back. She had decided years ago not to count certain things. "Do you have the documentation?" "I have the original copy. I have had it for 34 years. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the prairie. "This is going to require specific people," he said. "Someone with federal standing. Someone who can argue the law competently. Someone who—" "I've already written the letters," she said. He turned again. Faster than a man of 71 usually turned when, 6 months ago, when Greer started the first acquisitions. I could see the direction of it. Percival Oakes looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who thought he understood a situation and has just received information that requires him to revise his understanding upward by a significant degree. 6 months ago, he said. Just the 3 words. The tone of a man confirming that he has heard correctly. "I've been watching Aldous Greer for 20 years, she said. His father before that, and the letters. 3. One to a federal land attorney in Topeka. One to a deputy U.S. Marshal I have reason to believe is honest. One to a journalist at the Wichita Eagle, who has been covering Greer's operations in 2 other counties." She paused. "I sent them 6 months ago. I expect responses soon." Percival was quiet again. The stars were beginning to come out, fast and sharp in the cold, clear air, the way they do on October nights, when there are no clouds to slow them. "You've been sitting on this for 30 years, he said. "I've been preparing for 30 years, she said. That's different. Something in his posture changed. Something that had been careful became something else. more settled, the way a man settles when he realizes the ground under him is more solid than he had thought. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your name on a notarized document, and your presence when the time comes. People in this town trust you, Percival. They've stopped trusting the sheriff. They need someone to stand and tell them that what's happening is not the end of the story, is it not?" "It is not," she said. "When?" 14 days, she said, which is the deadline Greer's company has set, and which I have no intention of missing. She walked home under the stars. The wind had gone still, the way it goes sometimes on autumn nights, drop sudden and complete, as if the prairie is holding its breath. The cold was there, but without the wind it had a different character, still, almost respectful. She thought about Cormac. She thought about him less than she used to. Not because she had forgotten him. She had forgotten nothing, not one specific thing, and she had made her peace with that, with the way certain losses stay precise, while you yourself become less precise around them. She thought about him less, because the thinking had gradually shifted from grief to something more like orientation. The way a navigator takes a bearing from a fixed star. Not mourning, just checking the direction. He would have done this differently. He would have walked into the town meeting 30 years ago and laid the documents on the table and said, in that voice that was quiet and impossible to ignore, "Here is what is true and here is what we are going to do." He was not a patient man, Cormac. He was a just man, which is a different thing, and better, she had decided, but not always sufficient, without patience alongside it. She had learned patience from the years after him. From necessity, from the practical understanding that a 37-year-old widow, with a piece of paper and a dead husband's name, and no allies, had very few options, and that patience was the one that cost nothing and accumulated value over time. She came through her front door. The house was dark and cold. She lit the lamp, stoked the stove, made herself a small supper, and ate at the kitchen table with the Colt and the photograph and the open cedar box in front of her. She looked at Cormac's face in the photograph. 2 weeks, she said, to him. To whatever it meant to still speak to someone who had been gone for 30 years. She had decided a long time ago that it didn't matter what it meant. She was going to do it anyway. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she slept without dreaming. The letters arrived on a Thursday, which was not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a Thursday in October in Kansas, gray sky. Frost still on the ground at 8 in the morning, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant because it has learned, through long practice, that significance is better discovered than advertised. Harriet was at the table when she heard the horse. Old Pete Garland, who had carried the Clearwater Bluff mail for 11 years, and who moved at the same deliberate pace in all weathers, which was the pace of a man who has decided that urgency is a young person's affliction, and he has passed the age of afflictions he doesn't have to have. She was at the door before he reached the porch. He handed her 3 envelopes without comment and without dismounting. She looked at the return addresses, Topeka, Wichita, and one with a federal stamp she recognized immediately because she had studied that stamp for years, the specific appearance of it, knowing it was the one that would matter when the time came. "Morning, Mrs. Vane," Pete said. "Morning," Pete turned the horse and left. Business concluded. Weather coming. No reason to linger. She went inside, stood at the table, looked at the 3 envelopes, did not open them immediately, because, and this required honesty, which she had always preferred to the alternative. There was a version of this where the letters said no, where Calhoun, dressed in Topeka, had reviewed the documentation and found it insufficient, where the marshal had determined the matter was outside his jurisdiction, where the journalist had moved on to other counties and other stories, and had filed her correspondence in the drawer where things go when they are interesting, but not interesting enough. She had lived with that version for 6 months, had examined it carefully, had made herself look directly at it, the way you look at difficult things, without flinching and without looking away, because things you refuse to look at have a way of being larger than they are, and things you look at clearly are usually manageable. She had decided she was not afraid of it. She stood at the table for a moment anyway. Then she opened the first envelope, read it, set it down, opened the second, read it, set it down, opened the third. Read it twice, slowly, because federal language is specific language and specific language rewards close attention, and she had come too far to miss a word. She set the third letter down with the other two. Outside, the frost was lifting off the ground as the thin autumn sun worked at it with the patience of something that has all day and no particular hurry. Harriet sat down and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 months, in a year, in possibly several years, to feel something that was not patience, not yet relief. Relief required resolution, and there was still work between here and resolution. But adjacent to it, right next door, the feeling of a door opening that you have been standing outside for a very long time, something that felt like, yes, this is what it was for, all of it. This, she walked the mile into town at 7 in the morning and knocked on Percival Oakes's door. He opened it still in his coat, which told her he had already been out, which told her the town was already moving. She handed him the 3 letters without saying anything. He read them, standing at his kitchen table. He was a slow reader, Percival, the kind that goes back to check sentences, that holds a phrase up against what came before it, and considers whether they belong in the same document. She waited. She was good at waiting. He finished the third letter, set it down, put both hands flat on the table, and looked at the wall with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that is coming out differently than he expected. "The federal attorney," he said. "You've been corresponding with him since 1879. He looked at her. 1879, when I first began documenting Silas Greer's acquisition patterns in this county. I wanted to know, if the time came, whether the 1853 registration would hold under challenge. And he told me it would hold if it was properly filed and preserved. And it is. I have been a careful woman for 30 years. Percival." He picked up the federal letter. Read one specific paragraph again. Set it back down with the care of a man handling something that has just changed category. "This is extraordinary," he said. "It's documentation," she said. "It's 30 years of documentation." "That's what I said." He looked at her with an expression she recognized. "And who has known someone for a long time and just given reveals a dimension of them he had not previously understood was there." Awe was too large a word for it. But it was in that direction. The recalibration of a person's estimate of someone they thought they already understood. 12 days, he said, until Greer's deadline. "You said you needed my name on a document and my presence at a meeting." "Yes. I want to call the town meeting on day 10. Give the 3 men time to arrive and be settled. Give Greer time to feel the certainty of his position. Give the town time to arrive at the particular quality of desperation where people will pay attention to something they might otherwise dismiss. That's a narrow window. I've been threading narrow windows for 30 years. He almost smiled. The ghost of it. Not quite. What do you need from me today? Notarize the land documents and tell me who Sheriff Trace answers to. Specifically, which member of the county commission is not already in Greer's pocket. Percival's expression cooled slightly. Became more careful. Trace answers to the commission. 3 members. 2 of them have done business with Greer and Associates in the last 18 months. And the third, Delbert Huff. Cattle operation, northwest corner of the county. He's not corrupt, as far as I know. But he's not a man who volunteers for conflict. Could you speak with him? I could try. That's enough. She gathered the letters, put them back in their envelopes. Harriet, Percival said. She looked at him. Why now? He said. You've had this documentation for 30 years. Why not when Silas was alive and doing the same? Because Silas Greer killed my husband, she said, and I had no proof. I had my own account of a man leaving a dark field, and Silas Greer had 4 men who would testify under oath that he was in Abilene that night. If I had moved against him without proof, with only my word, I would have lost, and I would have been discredited. And the documentation would have been challenged, and the entire foundation I was building would have collapsed. Before it was finished. She paused, so I waited until his son overextended, until Aldous Greer got confident enough to make the specific mistake of coming after land that was already legally owned. By name, by registration, by federal record. She looked at him steadily. A man who steals from an anonymous widow is difficult to catch. A man who attempts to legally acquire land that belongs to someone who can prove it. That man has walked into something he cannot walk back out of. Percival was quiet for a long moment. You let him come to you, he said. Cormac always said, the best position to fight from is one your opponent has chosen for you. Because they've already convinced themselves they can win from it. She buttoned her coat. The documents, she said. This afternoon, if possible. He straightened. All 71 years of him. All 40 years of the law behind those years. Yes, he said. This afternoon. Aldous Greer arrived in Clearwater Bluff on a Tuesday. 11 days before his own deadline, Harriet had expected him. When you watch a man for 20 years, you develop a sense of his patterns. The way he thinks, the sequence in which he does things, the specific moments when personal presence becomes necessary to a man who prefers to conduct business through representatives. A situation like this. A minor legal obstruction, as he would characterize it, an administrative complication in an otherwise settled transaction, would eventually require his personal assessment. He would want to see it with his own eyes before the final stage. She was on her porch when his carriage came through, sitting with a book open in her lap. Appearing to read. Not reading. The carriage was good quality without being ostentatious. A deliberate choice. A man who understood that conspicuousness in his position was a form of vulnerability. He was 52. Aldous Greer. She knew his age, the way she knew many things about him. From documents, from newspaper accounts, from the systematic accumulation of observable fact that she had been engaged in for 2 decades. He was his father's height. His father's build. His father's way of scanning an environment, with the eyes of someone who is perpetually calculating what everything in view is worth. He did not look at her porch as the carriage passed. She was a woman on a porch, a widow. Old, no one of consequence. She watched him step down from the carriage in front of the hotel and disappear inside. She closed the book, went in. She saw him again that afternoon, at Wheaton's General, where the town did its daily commerce. She was at the counter with her flour and her coffee, when he came in with his associate, a younger man with a leather case, who had the expression of someone hired to be competent and professional on his employer's behalf. Greer and the associate were talking quietly, not making any particular effort to be private about it. The indifference of men who do not register the people around them as an audience. She bought her flour. She bought her coffee. She turned to go, and Aldous Greer saw her. His face did not change. Why would it? She was a woman buying flour. Then, his gaze went to her coat pocket, where the outline of the Colt was visible just barely, to someone paying attention. And something shifted, just slightly. Not alarm. More like the small internal adjustment of a man who has encountered something in a situation that wasn't on his map of it. He looked at her face. She looked at his right hand, the seal ring, the crest a stylized S for Silas, worn on the right hand, the same hand his father had worn it on. She had first seen that ring on a dark field in October 1857. She had confirmed it was real, not a detail Grief had invented, at a county auction 6 years ago, at 50 yards, watching from the edge of a crowd that didn't include her in its awareness. It was real. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was appropriate. Then she looked away, walked to the door, did not hurry, did not slow. Behind her, she heard him say something to his associate in a voice too low to catch. She didn't need to catch it. He had noticed her. That was exactly what she wanted. They came that night. She had expected this too. 2 men. Not Greer himself. That would have been a miscalculation, and Greer did not make that kind of miscalculation. But men from his operation. She had seen them arrive with the carriage. Noted the way they moved through town. She was on the porch when they came up the path at about 8 o'clock. The larger one leading, the other behind, and to the right professional posture. But not professionals. The Colt was in her coat pocket. She had her coat on and a blanket over her knees, which she had arranged, not because she was cold, but that wasn't the reason, but because a woman with a blanket over her knees is the specific image of harmlessness. And she had learned, over many years, that the image of harmlessness is one of the more useful things a person can project. They stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Evening," the large one said. "Evening," she said. She did not put the book down. She was not reading it, but she did not put it down. "Mr. Greer asked us to pass along a message." "Did he?" "He wanted you to know the acquisition notice on this property is in order, legal, and that residents who cooperate with the relocation schedule will receive." "Tell Mr. Greer," Harriet said, "that I have lived on this land since 1853, that my name is on the original federal claim, that I have documentation confirming this which has been reviewed by a federal land attorney who concurs with my position." The large man stared at her. She turned a page, which she was not reading. "Tell him that if he would like to discuss this further, he's welcome to come speak to me himself. I'm here most mornings." A pause. The second man said quietly, to the first, "She's bluffing." Harriet looked up at the second man. Maybe 30. The kind of face that had been good-looking once and had found other things to do with itself. "Son," she said, "I haven't bluffed at anything in 30 years. I don't believe I remember how anymore. What I'm telling you is simply what is true." She looked back down at the book. "Good night," she said. Neither man moved for a moment. Then the larger one made a sound that was not quite a decision. More like a recognition, the specific recognition of a man who has walked up to something and found that the thing is not what he was told it was and is not going to behave the way he expected it to behave. They turned and left. She listened to their footsteps until the dark absorbed them. Then she let out a breath. Long, slow, her hand was steady. had been steady the entire time, but her heart was moving at a pace that reminded her she was 67 and not, whatever her hands might indicate about her, a younger version of herself. The body remembers. That was the thing. The mind decides things, and the mind is very good at its decisions. But the body remembers dark fields, and the sound of boots on cold grass, and a voice calling out into a night that doesn't answer. The body remembers. She sat on the porch until the cold made it untenable. Then she went inside, made tea, sat at the tea table, opened the journal, and wrote the date. Greer's men came at 8, left without incident. He knows now that he has a complication he did not account for. She set the pen down, looked at the photograph. He's got his father's ring, she said quietly, the way she said things to the photograph. To Cormac. To whatever version of speaking to someone who has been gone 30 years this actually was. She paused. He's going to find out. It doesn't carry the same weight it used to. She closed the journal. On day 6, Nora Finch found a second notice on the schoolhouse door. Not from Greer and Associates, handwritten. Plain paper. Small, careful script. No signature, teacher students this week. Every one of them. Every day. Do not miss a single day. There are things in motion that you cannot see yet. Trust that the school will still be standing on Monday week. Nora read it 3 times. Then she looked up and down the road in both directions. The Widow Vane was not visible in any direction. But the handwriting, Nora had a teacher's understanding of handwriting. She had seen every variety of it over 7 years. The shaky first efforts of 6-year-olds, the improving work of 10-year-olds, the occasional surprising elegance of a 12-year-old who had been paying attention, and the various forms of adult handwriting which told you as much about a person's character as anything they said aloud. She could not have explained exactly why she was certain. But she was certain. She pinned the note to the inside of the door, where only she would see it when she arrived each morning. And on Monday, she rang the bell and every one of her 19 students came, and she taught them mathematics and the history of their country, and how to read a map, and how to write a letter that said exactly what they meant, and she did not miss a single. On day 7, Percival Oakes had a conversation with Delbert Huff that he did not describe to Harriet in detail. What he told her was, Delbert is a man who doesn't like injustice. He needs to believe something can be done before he's willing to act on that dislike. And now, Harriet said, and now he believes something can be done. Good. He asked about you, Percival said. Delbert's been here since 1861. He knows the Widow Vane from the western edge. That's all he knows. Good, she said again. You don't want him to know more. I want the right things known at the right time, she said. Not before. Percival shook his head. Not in disagreement. The specific bewilderment of a man who has been a lawyer for 40 years and is watching someone operate with a strategic patience that makes his own professional patience feel approximate. 3 men arriving Saturday, she said. The attorney, the marshal, the journalist. I need a meeting place that isn't visible from the hotel. My study, he said. Nobody looks twice at visitors to a retired judge. Perfect, she said. She stood to go. Hattie, he said. She looked at him. Are you afraid, he said. Just asking. No assumption built into it. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. Of losing, she said. No, I already lost the thing that was worth being afraid to lose. That was 30 years ago. Everything since then has been movement toward something, not running from something. Those are different directions, and they feel different in the body. And if this doesn't go the way you've planned, it will go the way I've planned. You can't. Percival, very quiet, very patient. The patience that has gone so deep it has become a form of gentleness. I have been watching Aldous Greer for 20 years. His father before that. I know how they think, how they move, what they believe about the people around them. She paused. They believe the people around them are passive. That acquisition is a matter of identifying what you want and applying sufficient, sustained pressure. They have never, not once, in 2 generations, encountered a situation where the target was not passive, where the target had been the one setting the conditions from the beginning. She put her hand on the door. This, she said, is that situation. She left. Saturday arrived. Quickly, without announcement. Without anything in the air that would have told you it was different from the Saturdays before it, except that it was. The afternoon train from Wichita came in at 2:15. 3 men stepped off. Harriet was not at the station. She had asked Percival to be there because a retired judge greeting the afternoon train was unremarkable, and unremarkable was the operational principle for the next 72 hours. She was at home, cleaning the Colt again, which did not need cleaning, but which was what her hands wanted to do when her mind was fully occupied with something else. Her hands had always had their own preferences. She had learned, over the years, to let them. At 4 o'clock she put on her good dress, just the dress with the slightly better buttons. At 4:30 she walked the mile into town, under a sky, doing complicated things, with clouds and the last of the afternoon light. She knocked on Percival's door at 5 minutes before 5. He opened it. Behind him, in the study, 3 men were already there, standing in the particular way of men who are in an unfamiliar situation and are waiting to understand how it will arrange itself. The attorney, Calhoun dressed, 50s, wire glasses, the specific neatness of a man for whom precision was not a preference but a professional requirement. He had been corresponding with Harriet for 8 years and had never met her. He looked at her now with the expression of a man revising something he had previously assumed. The letters had been meticulous, legally sophisticated in the ways that matter, and not showy in the ways that don't. He had apparently imagined someone different. She extended her hand. Mr. Dressed. Thank you for making the journey, Mrs. Vane. He shook her hand. I'll be honest. When I received your first letter in 1879, I told my associate that this was either the most methodical private citizen I had encountered in 20 years of practice, or a very sophisticated confidence operation. And which did you decide? I decided after the 3rd letter that it didn't matter, because the documentation was sound regardless of who had compiled it. He paused. I have since concluded you are the former. Kind of you, she said, the Deputy U.S. Marshal, Silas Reed, 40 maybe, dark-haired, the specific seriousness of a man who has internalized his authority as a responsibility rather than a reward. He was younger than she had expected. She noted the irony of his first name without dwelling on it. The world had a particular sense of humor about names and coincidences, and she had learned to receive it with equanimity. The journalist, Oberon Finch, 26, already had his notebook out. Young men with notebooks, Harriet thought, always ready before the thing begins. She had noted, in his letter of introduction, that his surname was Finch and had asked whether he was any relation to a Nora Finch of Clearwater Bluff. And he had written back that she was his second cousin, which Harriet had considered useful and had not mentioned to Nora. Sit, she said. They sat. She remained standing. You've all read the documentation I sent, she said, nods. Then you know the basic shape of what we're dealing with. Aldous Greer's company has been acquiring land in this county for 2 years, using legal purchase, questionable transfers, and As Mr. Drest has confirmed, fraudulent subsidiary filing in at least 3 identified cases. She looked at Drest. The 3 cases, he confirmed. Purchases made through a subsidiary that was not disclosed in the original county filings. Under Kansas statute, that constitutes fraud, and the 1853 Vane claim supersedes any subsequent filing on the central parcel, Drest said, with the certainty of Thompson, who has checked something so many times. That certainty is the only possible relationship to have with it. The federal registration is on record. The documentation is sound. Greer's company has been acquiring parcels around the claim, either without knowledge of the prior registration or without disclosing it. Either scenario is legally untenable for them, Marshall Reed said. Untenable is a gentle word for it. Very, Drest agreed. Harriet said, town meeting in 4 days. I want all 3 of you there. Mr. Drest to present the legal situation in language the room can follow. Marshall Reed, present in his official capacity, which will make clear to anyone considering resistance what the consequences of resistance would be, Reed said, and Greer. You expect him to attend. He can't afford not to, she said. He believes this is essentially resolved. He'll have characterized whatever obstruction he's heard about as a minor administrative complication that his attorney can address at the meeting. He won't want to miss what he expects to be his final step. You want him to walk into something he's already decided he's walking out of, Reed said. I want him to walk into a room he thinks he chose, she said, and discover that someone else chose it first. Auburn Finch, who had been writing continuously, looked up. Mrs. Vane, he said, may I ask, how long, exactly, have you been planning this? She looked at him, his young face, his notebook, the readiness of him since the night my husband was killed, she said. October 1857. The room was quiet. Auburn Finch wrote something, underlined it. On day 9, Aldous Greer came to see her. She had expected this. He was too controlled, too strategically self-aware, to send men a second time after the first pair had come back with nothing. He would come himself. Calculate that a personal visit, civil, professional, correct show of respect toward an elderly woman who was creating a legal inconvenience would accomplish what the other approaches had not. He knocked at 9 in the morning. She opened the door, his best suit. Not the traveling suit she had seen him arrive in. A better one, darker, better cut. The suit of a man who respects the person he is visiting enough to dress for it, which was a form of strategy masquerading as courtesy, and which she had always found more interesting than outright rudeness, because it required more thought. The ring was on his right hand. She noticed it the way she always noticed it. The way you notice something you have been watching for 30 years. Not with surprise, never with surprise, but with the specific quality of attention that has been honed over decades until it operates without effort. Mrs. Vane, he said. Measured voice. His father's voice, recalibrated. My name is Aldous Greer. I wonder if we might. I know who you are, she said. A beat, of course, he smiled. Practiced, calibrated, not false exactly. Men like Greer learn to mean their social expressions because it is more efficient than pretending. But constructed. I was hoping we might speak. About the property matter, she stepped back from the door. He came in, he looked around the kitchen the way he looked at everything. Calculating value, taking inventory. A small house, clean, sparse. The cedar box on the table, closed. The Colt on the shelf by the window, visible but not displayed, just present. The way a tool is present in a room where it belongs. His eyes went to the Colt and moved on. She sat down across the table. He took the other chair. Mrs. Vane, he said. I understand you have some concerns about the acquisition notice. I have no concerns, she said. I have documentation. Something shifted in his expression. The practiced quality gave way briefly to genuine attention, the way a mask shifts when the person wearing it encounters something unexpected. The land claim, he said, the 1853 federal registration. Both names, my husband's. Mine, Mrs. Vane. He leaned forward. Reasonable. Patient. The tone of a man explaining something to someone who has, through no fault of their own, misunderstood. Land claims from the early 1850s. They predate the county filing systems we have now. The legal weight they carry in 1887 against properly executed modern transfers has been confirmed by a federal land attorney, she said. Sysons, excuse me. The documentation has been reviewed by Calhoun, Drest of Drest and Associates in Topeka, who specializes in federal land law and has practiced it for 22 years. He has confirmed in writing that the 1853 registration constitutes valid prior claim on the central parcel. She paused, which includes the land under the schoolhouse, the church, the town well. Aldous Greer sat very still. He was a man who used stillness as strategy, the way his father had. The stillness of fast thinking that has decided the appearance of no movement is the best cover it has. She watched his right hand. It was still too. The ring caught the morning light. Mrs. Vane, he said. I'm not sure what you think I don't think anything, she said. I know. Those are different conditions. He studied her face. She let him. She had nothing in her face that she hadn't chosen to put there. Not deception. She was not a deceptive person. But economy. The discipline of showing only what was relevant. What is it you want? He said. The tone had changed. The reasonable land developer had not disappeared entirely, but it had thinned, the way ice thins in the first warm week of March. You can still see it. The water is showing through. I want the acquisition notices on all properties. Within the original Vane claim withdrawn, she said. I want the 3 transactions. Mr. Drest has identified as fraudulent reviewed by the correct members of the county commission. A pause, and I want to discuss the operations in the other 2 counties where your company has been working, which Mr. Drest has also been reviewing. Greer leaned back. Something had changed in the room, the pressure of it, the way a room changes when the power in it relocates without anyone standing up. He was afraid, not of her specifically, of what she had, of the cedar box on the table between them, of the fact that he had mapped this situation with great care and thoroughness, and the map was wrong, and the territory was completely different from what he'd believed. The ring caught the light again. She looked at it. That ring, she said. Very quietly, he looked down. I've seen it before, she said. He looked at her. October, she said. 1857. The color left his face, not quickly, gradually, the way frost leaves the ground. Slowly, and then all at once. My father's ring, he said, carefully. Each word placed precisely. Your grandfather's originally, I believe, she said. Silas wore it on his right hand. The same hand you wear it on. She let that sit in the room between them, watched him understand what she was telling him. Not accusation, not threat. Something more precise than either. She was telling him she knew, that she had known for 30 years. That 30 years of knowing had not been 30 years of nothing. It had been 30 years of documentation and correspondence, and watching and recording, and the patient assembly of everything that would be needed for the specific moment that was, as of right now, this moment. Aldous Greer was not his father. She had decided this years ago, and she believed it still. He had inherited an empire built on damage and had continued building it without. She chose to believe this, fully examining what it was built on. That was not innocence, but it was different from what Silas had been. And adjudicating that difference was not her job. Her job was the documentation in the cedar box and the names on the 1853 filing and 19 children who needed a school to be standing on Monday week. There is a town meeting, she said, Wednesday evening. I would suggest you attend. He stood. She did not. He put his hat on, moved to the door, did not turn around. Mrs. Vane, he said to the door. Mr. Greer, she said. He left without saying anything more. She waited until the sound of his horse was gone. Then she reached for the leather journal, opened it, wrote the date. Greer came. He knows. Wednesday. Set the pen down, smiled. Not the small, controlled thing she permitted herself, occasionally. Not the functional expression of a woman who has obtained what she needed from a conversation. A real smile, full, briefly unguarded, gone in a moment. But there, Wednesday came, day 10, 4 days before Greer's deadline, which, as of Wednesday morning, was no longer Greer's deadline in any meaningful sense. The deadline remained on the calendar. The calendar was no longer serving the purpose it had been created to serve. She dressed in her good dress, put the notarized documents in the leather satchel she had owned since 1860 and which had outlasted 3 pairs of boots and 2 horses, and showed every one of its years without apology. Checked the Colt pocket. Walked the mile into town under a sky that was for once doing nothing dramatic. Just clear and cold and blue, the kind of sky that doesn't comment, the kind that watches. She pushed the door of the town hall open and stopped, because the room was full. Not the usual half full that town meetings in Clearwater Bluff had been for the past 2 years, when people stayed home because staying home had begun to feel like the only rational response to being told, repeatedly, that nothing could be done. Full. Every chair. Standing room against the back wall. Men she hadn't seen at a public meeting in months. The Holloway family in the 3rd row. Old Tom Briggs, who was 81 and had told everyone he was done attending meetings, sitting in the 2nd row, and looking like a man who had decided to attend one more. Nora Finch was there. 2nd row, left side. 18 of her 19 students' parents visible in the room. The 19th was there too. Harriet saw, sitting in the back with a baby on her lap, and the expression of a woman who had walked 4 miles in the October cold because the school mattered. And she intended to be present while it was still possible to be present. Word had traveled, not through announcement, through the specific quality of the air when something is about to change, through the way Judge Percival Oakes had been walking purposefully for 4 days running, through the 3 strangers at the hotel who were not, visibly, associated with Greer and Associates. Harriet sat in the 2nd row, not the 1st. The 2nd, because this was not a performance. And the 1st row is where people sit when they want to be seen. Aldous Greer was in the 4th row, left side, his attorney beside him. The attorney had the expression of a man who has been thoroughly briefed and is confident in his briefing. Greer himself was contained. Still, the face of a man who has decided this meeting will go the way he expects it to go, who has already written the ending and is here to watch the conclusion arrive. He had not looked at her wherein she came in, which told her everything she needed to know. He was afraid of what looking at her would show. Percival Oakes called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. His voice in a room was still a remarkable instrument. 40 years in courtrooms had given it a quality that had nothing to do with volume. It was simply present, clear, the way a bell is present. You do not wonder if you have heard it. You have heard it He introduced Calhoun Drest. Drest stood, adjusted his glasses, and then spent 12 minutes explaining, in language that was precise and plain, and required no legal background to follow, what the 1853 Vane claim meant, what federal registration meant, what prior claim meant under Kansas law and federal statute, what it meant for the parcels Greer and Associates had been acquiring, what it meant for the schoolhouse, the church, the well. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The math was the math. Greer's attorney was on his feet before Drest finished his last sentence. This documentation has not been verified by the county. It has been verified by the Federal Land Office, Drest said, without looking up, which supersedes county jurisdiction in cases of original federal registration, which this is, the chain of title, is intact. I have the full documentation here, available for review. Would you prefer to examine it now, or? I would like to review it with my client before. You're welcome to. Drest looked at him now, over the wire glasses, with the patience of a man who has been in rooms like this many times, and understands that the person making noise is always rarely the person with the stronger position. The documentation has been available to any interested party for 34 years. It was filed in 1853. It has been in the federal record since before most people in this room were born. A pause. I don't believe additional review time is going to change what it says. The room was silent. Then Marshal Silas stood up. He said 4 sentences, that he was present in his official capacity as Deputy U.S. Marshal for the District of Kansas, that the fraudulent filings identified by Mr. Drest were being referred for federal investigation effective immediately, that any person or company obstructing the legal resolution of this matter would be in contempt of federal authority, that he would remain in Clearwater Bluff for the duration of the process. 4 sentences, and the temperature in the room changed, because a man with a federal badge saying 4 sentences in a town hall in Kansas in 1887 was not administrative, was not bureaucratic, was the sound of a door closing on a particular version of how this situation was going to end. Greer's attorney sat down. He sat down the way a person sits down when they understand that the argument they came to make is not the argument that applies to the situation they are actually in. Greer did not move, did not look at Harriet. Harriet did not look at Greer. She was watching the room, the faces of the people of Clearwater Bluff. She was watching the moment when people who have been told for 2 years that nothing can be done here, for the first time, a credible argument that something can. It looked like a held breath released. It looked like Tom Briggs in the second row, 81 years old, closing his eyes for a moment with the expression of a man who has just set down something very heavy. It looked like Nora Finch, third row, pressing one hand flat against the front of her dress, over her heart, like a person making sure something is still there. It was Rufus Dalt who broke it, which was, Harriet thought, almost inevitable. The specific kind of poetic inevitability that is really just the world being consistent with itself. He stood up from the third row, red-faced, the specific red of a man who has been publicly made to feel small and has decided that the only acceptable response is to become loud. I want to understand what we're supposed to believe here, he said. Loud. Performing. The same voice from behind the counter of his gun shop, the same register of a man who requires an audience in order to feel real. Some widow woman comes into my store asking about a gun, and suddenly she has the paperwork to stop a legal business transaction that the county has already. Rufus, someone from across the room, not louder than he was, just clearer. He wasn't stopping. I've been in this town 20 years. I've never heard of any vain land claim. I've never heard of any federal registration. Now we're supposed to hand over half the county based on Mr. Dalt, Percival Oakes's voice, which, as previously established, did not need volume. Rufus stopped. The documentation in question predates your arrival in Clearwater Bluff by 17 years, Percival said. The fact that you have not heard of it has no relevance to whether it exists. A measured pause. If you would like to review the notarized copies personally, copies which bear the seal of this office and the signature of Mr. Drest, who has verified them, you are welcome to do so at your convenience. The room went quiet. Then Rufus Dalt, with the specific viciousness of a man who has run out of arguments and knows it and is furious about knowing it, looked around the room at the specific men who had been in his shop 10 days ago and had laughed at the Widow Vane and said, "Fine. Then let's see her shoot." Since apparently she's some kind of expert, he was performing for them, calling back to the performance they'd all participated in. Let's see her prove she knows one end of a gun from the other before we hand over half the county on her word. Harriet stood up, slowly. The room watched her. She did not look at Rufus Dalt. She looked at Percival Oakes. He met her eyes. Raised his eyebrows very slightly. A question, not the question of whether it should happen. He was too smart for that. The question of whether she wanted it to happen the way Dalt was framing it, on Dalt's terms, in the way Dalt expected. She said, quietly, "Let him have it." Percival nodded. They went outside, all of them. Which was not planned. Which was what happens in small places when something real is about to occur, and everyone present understands, without being told, that this is not a moment to read about later in someone's account of it. You go. You stand there. You witness. The night was cold and absolutely clear. No wind. The stars out in force, the way they are on October nights in Kansas when the sky is doing its best work. Bright and close and innumerable, the kind of sky that makes the things people do under it feel briefly significant by contrast. The church stood at the end of the street, the bell post in front of it, 60 yards, maybe 65, in the dark. In the cold, Rufus Dalt stood 10 feet to Harriet's left. He had gotten what he asked for and was now inhabiting the specific posture of a man who has gotten what he asked for and is no longer certain he wanted it. He had expected her to refuse, or to attempt it and fail, or to be redirected by social pressure into some face-saving compromise that let everyone return to the positions they'd held before the evening began. He had not expected this. 40 people standing in the cold Kansas night waiting for an old woman to shoot, he said. The bell post. 5 shots, she said. 1 spot. He blinked. What? 5 shots. 1 spot. She looked at the post. Then at him, not 5 different places on the post. 1 place. 5 times. The same place, the red in his face did something complicated. The arithmetic of it, the specific realization that he had set the terms of this challenge, and the terms had just been revised upward by a significant degree. That's, he started. Yes, she said. It is. She turned toward the bell post, pulled the Colt from her coat pocket, did not raise it yet. 60 yards. Cold air. No wind. The wind that had been at this town for days had gone completely still, as if it too had decided to watch. The night was clear enough that she could see the post without difficulty. Could see the grain of the wood in the starlight, or believed she could, which was perhaps the same thing. Her body knew what to do. That was the thing. Her mind had done the 30 years, had done the patience and the watching and the documentations and the letters, and all the accumulated work of 3 decades of deliberate preparations. But her hands had learned their trade in a time when the land required things of people that the land no longer required, or required less visibly, or had outsourced to other instruments. Her hands had learned from her father, who had believed that skill was not something you saw selected for or against, based on the sex of the person learning it, something you passed on to anyone who was willing to pay attention, who had stood beside a young Harriet on the Ohio frontier and said, over and over, quiet and patient as a stone, "Slow down. You're trying to force it. Let the breath go first." She raised the Colt, sighted, breathed out, fired. The sound cracked across the night, and the town and the flat Kansas dark, and rolled out into the prairie, and came back thin and small, and then was gone once. She sighted again, breathed out, fired, twice. No hurry, no drama, no performance. Just the next shot placed where the last one was, because that was the point. That was the only point, and any other approach would miss it. 3 pause, 4 pause. 5 the echo went out and returned and dispersed. She lowered the Colt. The street was silent. Rufus Dalt looked at the bellpost, looked at Harriet, looked at the 40 people standing in the dark. He did not want to walk to the post. She could see that. It was visible in every line of him, the specific reluctance of a man who has set up a situation and is about to have to inhabit its result. But 40 people were watching, and there was no version of this where he didn't walk to the post. He walked slowly. The walk of a man buying time inside a decision that has already been made. He reached the post, looked at it, stood there for a long moment, turned around, said nothing, which was, itself, the answer. Percival Oakes walked to the post, examined it, turned back to face the street, the crowd, 40 people standing in the cold under the stars, said, simply, 1 hole, 2 words, no elaboration needed. Nora Finch put her hand over her mouth. Auberon Finch was writing in his notebook, had been writing since she raised the gun. Tom Briggs, 81 years old, said something too quiet to carry, but it had the sound of a man who has been waiting a long time for something and has just seen it. Aldous Greer stood at the edge of the crowd, with his attorney beside him and his father's ring on his right hand and his hands at his sides, and was looking at Harriet. Not calculating, not strategizing, not doing any of the things he had spent his professional life perfecting, just looking. She met his eyes. And what passed between them, 2 people who had been, without either of them fully choosing it, orbiting the same wound for 30 years, was not triumph, was not threat, was not any of the things that end with one person diminished and another elevated. It was recognition, the specific, exhausted, finally arrived at. Recognition of 2 people who have been circling something for a very long time and have found, at last, a place where the circling ends. He looked away first. The acquisition notices were withdrawn by Friday. All of them. Drest filed the counter-documentation with the county on Thursday morning. By noon, Sheriff Aubrey Trace had been formally notified that his endorsement of the Greer transactions was under federal review. By 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon, Trace had submitted his resignation to the county commission in writing. The 3rd member of the county commission, Delbert Huff, cattle farmer, northwestern corner of the county, a man who did not pick fights but did not appreciate injustice when it was placed directly in front of him, signed the formal acknowledgement of the Vane claim on Friday afternoon. The school stayed open. The church bell rang on Sunday morning. Harriet could hear it from her kitchen window, the sound of it moving across the flat land in the early quiet the way it had always moved. The way it had moved for 28 years. The way she had been hearing it since before the woman who now pulled the rope had been born. the well kept running, which it had always done, which it had not needed saving for, structurally. But now the people drawing water from it every morning knew it was theirs, that it would be theirs tomorrow, that there was a legal document in a federal record that said so, and that the document was solid and it was not going anywhere. Sometimes the knowledge that a thing is yours matters, as much as the thing itself. Auburn Finch's piece ran in the Wichita Eagle the following week. Front section, longer than his editor had wanted, and shorter than the story deserved. He described the town meeting, the legal argument, the three men from outside who had arrived on Saturday's train, the moment in the town hall when a federal marshal said 4 sentences and the temperature in the room changed. He described the bellpost, the night, the cold, 60 yards in the dark, 5 shots, 1 hole. He did not, at Harriet's specific request, delivered in writing before he left Clearwater Bluff, include her name. He used only the widow, which was what she wanted, which was, she had always known, the only word that needed to be in the piece, the only word that did all the work that the rest of the story was trying to do. The word that contained both the loss she had survived and the life she had built inside that survival, patience and the documentation, and the 30 years of deliberate quiet and the 5 shots in the dark, and everything, before and after. The widow. She signed the transfer document on Saturday morning, Percival Oakes's study. Just the two of them, and dressed and a notary. The document transferred the central parcel. The Vane claim, 1853, both names, into a land trust that she and Drest had spent the week structuring carefully. The trust held the land for the permanent benefit of Clearwater Bluff. The schoolhouse, the church, the well could not be sold, could not be acquired, could not be transferred to any private interest under any circumstances their collective legal ingenuity could anticipate. Forever, or as close to forever as human beings can make legal documents reach. She signed it with her full name, Harriet Vane. Set the pen down. Percival said, "You didn't have to do that." Cormac registered that land because he believed people should have ground under them that no one could take away, she said. That was always what it was for. He would have wanted you to keep something. I have something, she said. He looked at her. What? He said. She thought about it the way she thought about most things. Fully. Without hurrying. The cedar box. The photograph. The small hawk pressed into a gun grip 34 years ago by a man with a finishing nail and a small hammer in a kitchen in Kansas because he wanted her to have something of her own and because he understood that the things you mark belong to you. 30 years of watching and waiting and being patient, in a way patient that required more of a particular kind of courage than anything louder and faster would have required. The knowledge that Nora Finch would ring the school bell on Monday morning and 19 children would come and sit in rows and be taught the things that children need to be taught. The knowledge that it came out right, she said. That's enough. That is more than enough. She left before Sunday. No announcement. No farewell. No ceremony of departure. She packed what she needed into 2 bags. The cedar box, the photograph, the leather journal, a change of clothes, food for the road, the practical contents of a life stripped to what matters. She left the Colt on the kitchen table. Next to it, on a piece of paper, in her small, careful handwriting, this belongs to whoever needs it next. Use it correctly. She walked out of the house she had lived in since 1853, did not look back. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered so much that looking back would have stopped her. And she was 67 years old, and she had spent 30 years becoming a person who did not stop. and she intended to remain that person for however many years remained to her, wherever they were going to be spent. Percival Oakes found the house empty Monday morning. He had known, when she didn't answer his knock, that this was what he would find. He had known the way you know things about people when you have watched them be who they are for a long time. Harriet Vane was not a person who stayed after the thing was done. She had never been. She had been a person who did what needed doing and then moved in whatever direction was next, because there was always a direction. And standing still was not something she had ever been constitutionally suited to. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the Colt on the table, at the note, at the place on the floor where the cedar box had sat for 34 years and did not sit anymore. He picked up the Colt, looked at the initials on the grip, HV, and the small hawk, wings spread, no larger than a thumbnail. He stood in Harriet Vane's kitchen with her Colt in his hands, and the note on the table, and the morning light coming through the window she had looked out of for 34 years, and he thought about what it cost to be the kind of person she was, the specific price of that kind of patience, the specific discipline of carrying something for 30 years, without letting it become the only thing you were. The 30 years of twice-a-week trips to buy flour and coffee, and a small piece of salt pork, and of nodding to people who nodded at her, and of keeping the house in repair, and of watching, always watching, with the quiet attention of someone who knows that what they are watching matters. He set the Colt back down on the table, not because he didn't want it, but because it wasn't his, because she had said it belonged to whoever needed it next, and he had to trust that she had considered what that meant and had left it where it needed to be left. He put on his hat, pulled the door shut behind him, walked back into town in the Monday morning light. 3 years later, Auberon Finch was in Topeka, working on something different entirely. A piece about railroad land grants in 3 territories that had nothing to do with Clearwater Bluff. Nothing to do with any of it. Just ordinary research on an ordinary afternoon in the Federal Records Office. He pulled a folder from the 1853 section, Kansas Land Registrations, and there it was, the Vane claim, filed correctly, stamped. Both names in the original handwriting of a federal land clerk who had been doing his job on an ordinary day in 1853, with no way of knowing what he was part of. Cormac Vane, Harriet Vane. He sat with it for a moment. Then he turned the page. On the back of the registration document, in a different hand, smaller, neater, the precise handwriting of a person who has been careful with things for a long time, was something that should not have been there. Something that was not part of any official filing. Something that had been added after, slipped into the folder at some point between 1853 and now, left for whoever came next, for whoever eventually pulled this particular folder on this particular afternoon in Topeka. 4 words, that was all. We were here first. Auberon Finch read it twice, closed the folder, sat in the Topeka recorder's room for a long time, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and the dust moving slowly through it, the way dust moves in old rooms where old things are kept, unhurried and without destination. He had been 26 when he stood in the cold Kansas night and watched an old woman put 5 rounds through one hole at 60 yards in the dark. He was 29 now. Not much older in absolute terms, but different in the way that specific experiences make you different, the way that watching something real leaves a mark that time adjusts but does not remove. He thought about the widow. He thought about what 4 words written on the back of a land document meant. placed there by a hand that had been placing things where they needed to be for 30 years, before anyone knew to look. He thought about the schoolhouse. Still open, last he'd heard. Nora Finch still teaching, last he'd checked. The bell still ringing on Sunday mornings. The well still there. He opened his notebook and wrote it down. All 4 words. Then he sat for a moment longer, with his pen still in his hand, and the light moving across the desk, and the dust moving through the light, and he thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who plans for 30 years, sand, Hines. Over everything she built the plan to protect and walks out of a house she has lived in for 34 years without looking back. He thought, some people spend their whole lives being seen and understood and celebrated, and it adds up to nothing you can find in a federal records folder 3 years later. And some people spend 30 years being nobody and leave 4 words. And the 4 words are enough. He closed the notebook, put it in his bag, stood up, walked out of the Topeka Records office into the afternoon, which was ordinary and bright and indifferent, and completely unaware that anything of significance had just occurred inside it. Which was, he thought, exactly how she would have wanted it.